Welcome. I'm David Brooker, and you're listening to the Old Soul Podcast, exploring spirituality and life. For the past 45 years, I've been actively engaged in Christian ministry, working at what is often described as the progressive end of the theological spectrum. Energized and intrigued by the wonder of creation, by the diversity of humanity, by the mysteries of life, and by a pervading sense of connection with that which is beyond me. Something that stirs my soul, something bigger than me. In my retirement, I remain committed to rigorous theological and biblical scholarship, open to new ideas and enthusiastic about dialogue with those who live at different points on the Christian theological spectrum, and with those who live within different faith traditions. You'll find that diversity represented within my presentations. I began writing a blog primarily to sustain and kindle my own ongoing thought and practice. But I've been encouraged to share these ramblings from the cobwebs of my mind with a wider audience. And I count it a privilege that you may be interested in reading and or listening to my material. I look forward to your feedback. I hope you might even choose to subscribe to my site at www.oldsoul.blog. Thank you for checking it out. Now let's get into this week's episode. Greetings. I'm David Brooker, and this is the Old Soul Podcast. This is episode 5, Less But, More And. Way back in the 1980s, I had a student ministry at the Brighton Church of Christ in Melbourne. I was part of a team that included an elderly retired minister, Harold Bischoff, and another student, Debbie Wright. One day, in a team meeting, I learned a lesson that I have never forgotten. Harold had suggested something, I can't recall anymore what it was, and I had replied, "Yes, but..." Before I could go on, Harold exclaimed, "Yes, but. There's always a but with you, isn't there, David?" My but was clearly unhelpful and obstructionist. Lesson learned. That moment came to mind again this week when I reread an article by author and social commentator Diana Butler Bass. She was discussing the dynamics of the US presidential campaign. Writing specifically about the importance of "and," she contrasted the new Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, who, in the words of the US Religion News Service, is by birth both black and South Asian, both Christian and Hindu, contrasted her with the Republican candidate Donald Trump, who based his previous campaign on building a wall. Butler Bass reflected on the contrast between the bridge-building force of the word and the divisive image of building walls. Says Bass, "This election is about choosing between bridges and walls. Do we want to span that which seems impossible to connect, or strengthen the fortifications that separate?" Well, I'm fascinated, as well as dismayed and perplexed, by the dynamics of the US presidential campaign. That's not actually my focus here, but I do think this contrast between and but also has application much closer to home, and that's what I want to discuss. The Olympic Games are kicking off in Paris as I speak. Championing the spirit of global cooperation, athletes from around the world will compete over the coming days with goodwill and harmony, even as so many of the countries they represent are racked in conflict. Athletes from places like Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Myanmar, Niger, Somalia, Ethiopia and more will have left conflicted countries to become bridge builders in the context of a war-torn world. All power to them. May their "and" stand as a powerful counter to the "but" of political and military tension. And may the rest of us choose again and again to be "and" sayers rather than "but" sayers in the quest for a more peaceful world. Another application. My observation is that the Australian political scene is becoming increasingly polarised, with the major parties much more likely to use the word "but" than the word "and" in the context of parliamentary debate. In fact, it appears that the automatic response of each party is to oppose any idea or policy from the other party as a matter of course. But before "and" every time. Very occasionally there is a bipartisan approach to a problem, and lo and behold, something gets done. If only we could give our politicians permission and encouragement to be "and" sayers, not to have to agree on everything, but to accept that diversity of opinion is a value and a strength of the democratic process, and that far from being a sign of weakness or capitulation, compromise is a pathway to effective, cohesive action. A third application. I have personally experienced the "and" profoundly in the context of the interfaith movement. As chair of the City of Kingston Interfaith Network some years ago, I was privileged to sit at the table with representatives of diverse faith groups for many years, and to discover in that context the importance and power of "and." There were many different ideologies, understandings, practices and backgrounds amongst network members, just as there were many similarities and shared values. And each member was free to articulate, affirm and espouse their personal beliefs and practices, while similarly affirming and respecting the beliefs and practices of those around them. This did not lead, as some critics of the interfaith movement have suggested, to a hodgepodge of confusion of truth and faith. Rather, it led to a place of acceptance, harmony, and assurance, as each faith group was given space, legitimacy, and freedom. "And" rather than "but." Inclusion rather than division. One final application. Most of my working life has been within the context of the Churches of Christ in Victoria and Tasmania. Over recent years, there has been a slow but accelerating shift in our movement towards the conservative end of the theological spectrum. Of course, there has always been a mix of progressive and conservative congregations within our movement, a diversity that has been embraced as a strength as we have lived out of the "and" vocabulary, building bridges between people of diverse opinions on the basis that each congregation is free to hold to its own values and perspectives. But recently the language and the culture has shifted. Boundaries have been defined and lines are being drawn to designate who is in and who is out. It looks and feels to me much more like wall building than bridge building. Specific examples of this shift have been the debate over marriage equality, the regulation of ministry accreditation, the erosion of congregational autonomy, the development of a set of ministry attributes that are focused more on right practice than on formation and character, and the trend toward a centralist governance model at the expense of flexibility and diversity. To devalue the life-giving and inclusive "and" that has been at the core of our movement risks, I believe, replacing the unity in diversity upon which it was founded with a superficial unity in homogeneity that is the product of the shedding of those who are other-minded to leave only those who are like-minded. Whether in civil society or in church circles, this trend away from "and" toward "but," away from building bridges to building walls, is concerning. It's also inconsistent with the core values of the Christian faith. Stephen Patterson argues in his book, The Forgotten Creed, that the very earliest church creed was possibly a baptismal liturgy that is recorded in Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he writes, "In Christ you are Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female, you are all one in the Spirit." Isn't it wonderful that in this increasingly divisive and polarized world, people of goodwill, including people of faith, are modelling a different way, the way of "and," the way of acceptance and inclusion, affirming that, in the words of Butler Bass again, we are all children of God, you and your neighbour, and immigrants, and believers of other faiths, and Democrats, and Republicans, and. Perhaps this small, seemingly insignificant word "and" may empower the creation of a world of human dignity, equality and justice for all. A world where walls are torn down and bridges built in their stead. That's what I've been thinking about. You've been listening to the Old Soul podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Well, that's it for this podcast. Thanks for sticking it out to the end. I do hope you found it worthwhile. Incidentally, if you prefer to read rather than listen, you can find the text of this podcast, along with a host of other resources, at www.oldsoul.blog. And do subscribe if you would like to be notified of future presentations. This is David Brooker, and I look forward to catching you next time.